The sizzle of garlic and herbs filled the modern penthouse kitchen as Daniel Finch, a meticulous and disciplined real estate tycoon, prepared dinner. Cooking was Daniel's way of escaping the relentless demands of his work, a rare moment of calm in his otherwise high-stakes life. The late afternoon sun bathed the kitchen in a warm glow, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows. As he plated the perfectly crusted salmon, he heard the sharp click of heels against the polished hardwood floor. His wife, Josefina, appeared, her tight black dress and heavy makeup making her almost unrecognizable from the woman he had been married to for 14 years. She paused to check her reflection in the microwave door, her lips curving into a self-satisfied smirk. "Don't wait up, babes," she said flippantly, smoothing her dress. "I've got plans tonight." "Plans?" Daniel asked, setting down his knife. His calm tone masked the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. He was a man who could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without flinching, but the weight of suspicion in his gut was something else entirely. "Fernando's taking me out," she replied, glancing at him with mock amusement. "You know, my new lover. Thought it was time you knew." The knife in Daniel's hand didn't waver as he set it beside the cutting board, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers through the reflection. He'd built his empire on precision and patience, but her audacity pushed him to the brink. "You walk out that door tonight, Josefina," he said evenly, "and you leave behind everything we've built." "Everything." Josefina laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the pristine kitchen. "Oh, Daniel. You're predictable, boring. You think I care about your rules? Fernando knows how to treat a real woman." Maria, the housekeeper, hesitated in the doorway, her eyes wide. Daniel turned to her, his voice calm. "Maria, take the rest of the day off." "With pay?" "Yes, Mr. Finch," Maria replied, casting a disapproving glance at Josefina before leaving. Josefina grabbed her designer purse, a gift from Daniel on their last anniversary, and strutted to the door. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said with venom in her tone. "Enjoy your boring life." The door slammed behind her, leaving Daniel in the quiet tension of the kitchen. But he wasn't broken. Instead, he picked up his phone and made a call. "Rodney," he said, his voice steady. "Execute Plan Zero." The wheels of Daniel's revenge were set in motion. By the time Josefina realized what was happening, it would be far too late. The silence in Daniel's penthouse that night was deceptive, hiding the meticulous calculations forming in his mind. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring out over the city skyline. Josefina's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a calculated move, and Daniel was determined to understand every detail before striking back. The next morning, Rodney, Daniel's trusted aide and tech specialist, arrived at the office. Rodney was a quiet, methodical man, the kind who never asked unnecessary questions. Daniel handed him a dossier containing Josefina's basic schedule and connections. "I need everything," Daniel said. "Her calls, her texts, her transactions. And find out what you can about Fernando. I want to know who he is, who he owes, and why he thinks he can cross me." Rodney nodded, his expression unreadable. "Give me 48 hours. Meanwhile, Daniel contacted Sue Kramer, a seasoned private investigator known for her discretion and results. Over coffee in a quiet, upscale cafe, Daniel laid out the situation. "She's been seeing this man, Fernando. He's manipulative, opportunistic, and broke," Daniel explained, sliding a photo of Fernando across the table. "I want to know how deep their relationship goes and whether this is about more than just money." Sue picked up the photo, her sharp eyes scanning the face of the man in the picture. "This isn't just about catching her in the act, is it?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No. This is about taking control before they do more damage. I need leverage." By the end of the week, Rodney and Sue returned with damning findings. "Josefina's been transferring small amounts of money to an offshore account," Rodney explained, showing Daniel a digital map of the transactions. "It's subtle, but over the past 6 months, it's added up to hundreds of thousands." She's siphoning funds from your joint accounts. Daniel's jaw tightened as Rodney continued. Fernando is in deep financial trouble. His construction business is hemorrhaging money, and he's defaulted on several loans. Josefina's funding his lifestyle. Sue added her own findings. The two of them have been meeting regularly at a high-end hotel downtown. I've got photos, timestamps, and security footage. They're brazen about it. She's practically flaunting your money in public. Daniel examined the evidence with a calm, focused intensity. The betrayal ran even deeper than he'd feared. But now, he had everything he needed to strike back. That evening, Daniel returned home and sat at the dining table, sipping his whiskey and waiting for Josefina. She walked in late, her cheeks flushed and her demeanor confident. Out with Fernando again? Daniel asked, his voice casual but with an edge. Josefina froze for a moment, then scoffed. Oh, please. Don't start, Daniel. You don't have the right to question me. Daniel's smile was cold. No, but I do have the right to protect what's mine. You should know, Plan Zero is already in motion. She frowned, confusion and unease flickering across her face. What the hell is that supposed to mean? You'll find out soon enough, Daniel said, standing and leaving the room. Enjoy what's left of your little game. Josefina stood there, her confidence shaken for the first time. Rodney worked late into the night from Daniel's home office, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I've initiated the asset transfers, Rodney said, his voice calm as he explained the process. Your personal accounts are secured, and I've rerouted the corporate funds Josefina had access to. She'll hit a wall if she tries to withdraw another cent. Daniel nodded, the tension in his jaw easing slightly. Good. And the offshore account? Frozen, Rodney confirmed. She won't be able to move anything out of it without triggering alerts. The bank is on standby to flag suspicious activity. Daniel allowed himself a small, grim smile. Josefina's financial lifeline was officially cut off. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Church, Daniel's longtime attorney, was poring over the evidence collected by Sue and Rodney. In his sleek downtown office, he arranged files neatly on his desk, each labeled with meticulous detail: infidelity, fraud, financial misconduct. You've handed me a gift, Daniel, Jeffrey said during a late-night meeting at Daniel's penthouse. This level of documentation makes the divorce case ironclad. With this evidence, she won't see a penny more than what's legally required. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey. Make sure she knows that. I want her to realize she's backed into a corner before this even hits the courtroom. Jeffrey smirked. Consider it done. While Daniel dismantled Josefina's financial access, Sue and Rodney targeted Fernando. This guy is a mess, Sue said, spreading photos and financial documents across Daniel's desk. He owes millions to creditors, and his construction projects are dead in the water. We've also tracked shady loans he's taken out under fake companies. Rodney added, I leaked the details of his debt to a few key investors. They're already pulling out. By the end of the month, his business will be unsalvageable. Daniel studied the documents, his sharp eyes scanning the web of deceit Fernando had built. And his wife? Gladys, Sue replied. She's filed for separation. Apparently, she's been suspicious for months, and when I sent her proof of his affair with Josefina, she decided she'd had enough. Good, Daniel said, his tone cold. Let Fernando feel what it's like to lose everything. As the financial and personal pressure mounted on Josefina and Fernando, Daniel made a calculated public announcement. In a high-profile press conference, he unveiled Sentinel Heights, a new luxury real estate project. The announcement sent a clear message to the business world: Daniel Finch was as strong as ever. I want Fernando to see this, Daniel told Rodney after the conference. Let him know that while he's scrambling to keep his head above water, I'm building an empire. Josefina, now cut off from her finances and increasingly isolated, began to sense that her once perfect plan was unraveling. She tried contacting Daniel, leaving voicemails filled with indignation and thinly veiled desperation. "You can't just freeze me out," one voicemail said. "We're still married, Daniel. You can't do this to me." But Daniel never returned her calls. Meanwhile, Fernando was facing the consequences of his crumbling business. Creditors began circling, his investors abandoned him, and the luxurious life he'd built on lies was slipping away. By the end of the week, Daniel stood in his penthouse, surveying the city below. The trap was set, the players positioned exactly where he wanted them. He knew it was only a matter of time before Josefina and Fernando tried to make a desperate move. And when they did, he would be ready. Daniel sent Josefina a text. "We need to talk. Meet me at the Sentinel boardroom. Bring Fernando if you want him involved." She replied within minutes, "About time you decided to talk like an adult." It was exactly what Daniel had expected. He knew Josefina's confidence was her weakness, and he intended to exploit it fully. The Sentinel boardroom, perched on the top floor of Daniel's flagship property, offered a breathtaking view of the city. But the tension in the air was palpable as Josefina and Fernando entered. Josefina wore her usual arrogance like a shield, while Fernando looked uneasy, his charm failing to hide the cracks in his facade. Daniel stood at the head of the long table, flanked by Rodney and Jeffrey. A laptop sat open in front of him, ready for the confrontation. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said smoothly, gesturing for them to sit. Josefina crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Get on with it, Daniel. What do you want?" Fernando stayed silent, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "What I want," Daniel began, his voice calm but laced with steel, "is for both of you to understand the gravity of your situation." He clicked a button on his laptop, and the first slide appeared on the screen, screenshots of Josefina's bank transfers to the offshore account, followed by photos of her and Fernando entering the downtown hotel. Josefina's smirk faltered. This is invasive, Daniel. You can't just spy on me." "I can when it's my money you're stealing," Daniel shot back. He switched to the next slide, a document outlining Fernando's fraudulent loans and mounting debts. "And as for you, Fernando, you've been using my wife's betrayal to fund your sinking business. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Fernando's face turned pale. "Daniel, this isn't what it looks like." "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," Daniel interrupted. "And it's all documented. The money transfers, the hotel records, the fake companies. I even have statements from your former investors, who were more than happy to share how you conned them." At a signal from Daniel, Jeffrey stood and placed a thick envelope in front of Josefina. "Divorce papers," Jeffrey said simply. "Along with a comprehensive breakdown of your financial misdeeds. You'll find that your access to Daniel's accounts has been permanently revoked." Josefina's jaw dropped. "You can't do this. I'm your wife." "Not for much longer," Daniel replied coldly. Rodney stepped forward, placing another envelope in front of Fernando. "And this is for you," he said. "A lawsuit for fraud, along with a cease and desist order. You'll also find a notice that your remaining investors have filed criminal charges." Fernando sank back in his chair, his confidence shattered. As the meeting reached its climax, Daniel played the final card. He opened an audio recording on his laptop, one of Josefina and Fernando planning their scheme, unaware they'd been recorded. Josefina's voice filled the room. "Once I get the money from Daniel, we can start fresh. He won't even see it coming." Fernando's reply was just as damning. "Perfect. Once the accounts are drained, I'll move it through the offshore setup. He'll be too busy trying to clean up the mess to come after us." Josefina's face turned red, and she lunged for the laptop. "Turn that off." Daniel stood, his composure unshaken. "It's already been turned over to the authorities," he said. "You're done, Josefina. Both of you are." News of the confrontation leaked within hours, thanks to Rodney's strategic press contacts. By the next morning, headlines were ablaze. "Real estate mogul exposes wife's infidelity and business partner's fraud in dramatic takedown." Fernando's remaining investors pulled out, and his company declared bankruptcy within a week. Meanwhile, Josefina found herself cut off from Daniel's wealth and shunned by her social circle. The weeks following the confrontation were a whirlwind of consequences. For Josefina and Fernando, their once glamorous lives unraveled with astonishing speed. Josefina sat alone in a rented studio apartment, a far cry from the lavish penthouse she had once called home. The hum of the old refrigerator and the flickering overhead light were constant reminders of how far she had fallen. She scrolled through her phone, desperately trying to contact old friends, but the responses were either curt or non-existent. Her former social circle had distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone whose scandal had dominated the tabloids for weeks. Her financial situation was equally grim. With her accounts frozen and no access to Daniel's wealth, she had no choice but to sell her designer bags and jewelry. Even her attempts to reach out to Daniel for help were met with silence. One evening, she stared at the divorce papers Daniel had served her. Every clause and condition was a testament to his precision. The settlement offered her just enough to cover basic expenses, but nothing more. Her phone buzzed, a message from Fernando. "We need to talk." She hesitated but replied, "You've done enough damage." Meanwhile, Fernando's situation was no better. The fallout from Daniel's actions had triggered a chain reaction. His remaining investors pulled their support, his creditors demanded immediate repayment, and legal charges against him mounted. In a cramped conference room, Fernando met with his lawyer, a weary man who had already prepared him for the worst. With the evidence Daniel provided, the lawyer said, "You're looking at bankruptcy and likely jail time. Your best option is to cooperate with the authorities and hope for a reduced sentence." Fernando slumped in his chair, his bravado gone. The flashy suits, expensive cars, and luxury apartments were all gone, seized to repay his debts. Amid the chaos, Daniel found himself sitting across from his parents in their cozy suburban home. His mother, Judith, looked at him with a mixture of concern and pride. "You've been through a lot," Judith said, pouring him a cup of tea. "But was it worth it, Daniel? All this revenge?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't about revenge, Mom. It was about protecting what's mine. They would have destroyed everything I worked for." His father, Harold, nodded solemnly. "You did what you had to do. But don't let this consume you. You've won. Now it's time to move forward." Their words stayed with Daniel as he drove home that night. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to think about the future, not the past. Back at the Sentinel office, Daniel poured his energy into expanding his company. The Sentinel Heights project, which had served as a symbolic victory during the confrontation, became a reality. The groundbreaking ceremony was a testament to his resilience, with journalists praising his ability to thrive in the face of personal and professional betrayal. Rodney and Sue, loyal as ever, stayed by his side, ensuring every loose end from the scandal was tied up. But Daniel also began to focus on himself. He reconnected with old friends, started attending industry events again, and even began exploring the possibility of dating. "Take it slow," Sue advised over lunch one day. "You've been through a war. Don't rush into the next battle." Daniel chuckled. "Wise as always, Sue." Josefina sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, the divorce papers spread before her. Every word felt like a condemnation of the life she had squandered. For days, she had been rehearsing what she would say to Daniel, convinced she could find a way back into his good graces. She dialed his number, her hand trembling. "Hello?" Daniel's voice was as calm and measured as ever, but she could sense the distance in his tone. "It's me," she said quietly. "Daniel, please, can we meet? Just to talk." There was a long pause before he replied. "There's nothing left to say, Josefina. You made your choices. I've made mine." "Daniel, I made mistakes," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "But we were good together once. Can't we try again?" "No," Daniel said firmly. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we built. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be with me. The line went dead. Josefina stared at her phone, the weight of finality sinking in. Fernando's courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators eager to witness the downfall of the once flamboyant businessman. Daniel chose not to attend, preferring to receive updates from Rodney and Sue. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the verdict was announced, guilty on all charges. Fernando was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. In a brief statement to the press, Daniel simply said, "Justice has been served. Now, it's time to move forward." Despite his victory, Daniel knew there was one final step to take before he could fully move on. He agreed to meet Josefina one last time, on neutral ground, in a quiet cafe. She arrived looking more subdued than he had ever seen her, her once polished demeanor replaced with vulnerability. "Thank you for meeting me," she began. Daniel nodded but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Josefina said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I regret everything." Daniel studied her for a moment before responding. "I believe you're sorry," he said finally. "But regret doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't bring back the trust you destroyed." Josefina wiped a tear from her cheek. "Do you hate me?" Daniel shook his head. "No. But I don't feel anything for you anymore. And that's worse, isn't it?" She nodded, her expression crumpling. "I'll always love you, Daniel. Even if I don't deserve to." Without another word, Daniel stood and walked away, leaving her to confront the life she had created. With the chapter of betrayal behind him, Daniel turned his attention to the future. Sentinel Heights, his ambitious real estate project, became a beacon of his resilience and vision. The groundbreaking ceremony was a celebration of his triumph over adversity. In his personal life, Daniel found himself cautiously exploring new connections. He met someone who valued honesty and shared his drive for success. Their relationship was a slow, steady process, built on mutual respect rather than whirlwind passion. One evening, as he stood on the terrace of his penthouse, watching the city lights below, Rodney joined him. "You did it," Rodney said simply. "No," Daniel replied, a faint smile on his lips. "We did it." For the first time in months, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The betrayals that had nearly destroyed him had instead forged a stronger, wiser man. And as he looked out over the skyline, he knew he was ready to embrace whatever the future held. Months turned into a year, and the storm that had once consumed Daniel's life became a distant memory. The fallout from Josefina and Fernando's betrayal had faded into the background, leaving behind lessons that shaped his future. One evening, Daniel found himself back in the same kitchen where it had all begun. The polished granite counters gleamed under the soft glow of the lights, and the faint scent of garlic and herbs filled the air. Cooking had always been his therapy, and now, it symbolized his return to a life of control and peace. As he plated a perfectly seared steak, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. Josefina's audacity, Fernando's desperation, the courtroom drama, it had been a crucible that tested every fiber of his being. But instead of breaking him, it had made him stronger. Josefina's life remained a shadow of its former self. Without Daniel's support or the lavish lifestyle she had grown accustomed to, she was forced to work to make ends meet. The designer dresses and opulent parties were replaced with a modest wardrobe and quiet nights alone. Fernando, meanwhile, was serving his prison sentence. His once brash confidence had eroded under the weight of his failures. Letters from Josefina occasionally arrived, but they went unanswered. He had gambled everything and lost, not just his fortune, but the respect of everyone he once considered an ally. Sentinel Heights, Daniel's flagship real estate project, had become a resounding success. The sleek towers stood as a symbol of his resilience, a reminder that he could rebuild even after the deepest betrayal. On the personal front, Daniel had begun to open his heart again. He met a woman, Caroline, who shared his passion for business and his no-nonsense approach to life. Their relationship was built slowly, on trust and mutual understanding. One evening, as they walked along the bustling streets near Sentinel Heights, Caroline stopped to admire the towers. "You've built something incredible," she said, looking up at him. Daniel smiled, his gaze steady. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." Years later, Daniel stood on the rooftop of Sentinel Heights, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and crimson. Beside him stood Rodney and Sue, his trusted allies, who had been with him through every step of his journey. "You know," Rodney said, breaking the silence, "there was a time I thought this whole thing might break you." "It almost did," Daniel admitted. "But I realized something: betrayal doesn't define you. How you respond to it does." Sue raised her glass of champagne. "To rebuilding, then. Stronger than before." They clinked glasses, the sound echoing softly in the evening air. As Daniel looked out over the city he had helped shape, he felt a profound sense of peace. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer hurt. Instead, they served as a reminder of his resilience, his determination, and his ability to reclaim his life, no matter the odds. And for the first time in years, Daniel Finch felt truly free. The late afternoon sun bathed Luther Swanson's backyard in golden light, casting long shadows over the perfectly trimmed grass and the silver 25th anniversary banner his daughter, Connie, was carefully adjusting. At 16, Connie carried herself with the same precision and determination as her father, a legacy of his 15 years in the Special Forces. Her eyes mirrored his sharp focus, a reflection of his military discipline instilled in her through years of shared projects and backyard lessons. "Lift the left side a little higher, sweetheart," Luther called out, his deep voice carrying the commanding edge that once directed elite missions. Connie adjusted the banner with practiced ease and glanced back for approval. "Better?" she asked, her tone calm but eager for his feedback. "Perfect," Luther replied, offering a rare smile. Across the yard, Vera, his wife of 25 years, fussed with flower arrangements on the buffet table. Her movements were uncharacteristically jittery, her hands trembling as she adjusted roses that didn't need adjusting. Luther watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the nervous energy in her posture and the way her eyes flitted to her phone. She seemed to be carrying an invisible weight, one he hadn't noticed before. "You're going to ruin the flowers if you keep messing with them, Mom," Connie said, climbing down from the stepladder. Vera snapped, "I just want everything to be perfect." Her sharpness melted into a softer tone. "Your father deserves a perfect anniversary party." Luther's jaw tightened as he observed her, cataloging her behavior with the same precision he once used to assess battlefield threats. Over the past few months, there had been subtle shifts, more late nights at work, a new password on her phone, and a guarded distance in her demeanor. He hadn't brought it up yet, but his instincts told him something was wrong. As the first guests began to arrive, Luther buried his concerns. He greeted neighbors and coworkers with measured warmth, his steel blue eyes scanning the crowd as if assessing a new mission site. Connie took over as hostess, proudly leading her father to the anniversary cake she had designed herself. "Look, Dad. I wrote 25 years of love exactly the way you told me stories about you and Mom." But even as Luther admired her work, his tactical awareness caught the subtle unease weaving through the crowd. Guests exchanged knowing glances when Vera's coworkers from the high school arrived, whispering behind their wine glasses. Luther's attention snapped into sharper focus when Vera introduced him to Stephen Herring, the school's wrestling coach. "Luther, this is Stephen," Vera said, her voice wavering slightly. "He's been such a close friend at work." Stephen, dressed sharply in a suit far too formal for a backyard gathering, extended his hand. Luther shook it, applying just enough pressure to make the younger man flinch. "Pleasure to meet you," Luther said, his tone neutral but his gaze piercing. Stephen's smile faltered as he withdrew his hand. "Vera's told me so much about you," he said, flexing his fingers discreetly. As the party settled into a rhythm of laughter and conversation, Luther's eyes never left Stephen for long. He noticed the man's frequent glances toward Vera and the smug confidence in his posture. every fiber of Luther's being screamed that Stephen was more than just a coworker. The evening took a shocking turn when Stephen, manila envelope in hand, strode through the yard, his face alight with smug satisfaction. "Vera," he called loudly, silencing the crowd, "stop pretending. Everyone knows the truth about us. It's time to end this charade." Guests froze, their murmurs falling silent as Stephen turned to Luther, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Your daughter, Connie, the one you've been so proud of? She's not yours. Here's the proof." He brandished hospital records with the smugness of a man who thought he'd won. Time seemed to slow as Luther processed the betrayal. His combat instincts kicked in, cataloging every detail, Stephen's stance, the shocked expressions of the guests, and most tellingly, Vera's lack of surprise. When Stephen grabbed Vera's arm possessively, Luther moved without hesitation. His military training took over, dislocating Stephen's shoulder in a swift, calculated motion. Stephen screamed as guests scattered, and Vera's carefully composed mask shattered. Connie stood frozen by the cake she had designed with so much pride, the serving knife slipping from her hand and quivering in the patio boards. Her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on Luther's as if searching for reassurance. Luther met her gaze with unwavering resolve. Whatever the DNA test claimed, he knew one truth: he was Connie's father, and no piece of paper could rewrite the bond they had built. The air in the backyard was heavy with tension, the stunned silence broken only by Stephen's pained groans as he cradled his dislocated shoulder. Luther stood over him, his hands clenched into fists, veins bulging in his forearms. He looked like a man ready for war. "Get up," Luther said coldly, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. Stephen struggled to his feet, wincing with every movement. "You're insane," he spat. "This is assault. You'll pay for this." "No," Luther growled, stepping closer. "What you did, walking into my home, humiliating my family, that's something you'll pay for." He glanced at the guests, many of whom were clutching their phones, but hesitant to intervene. "Get him out of here before I change my mind about letting him leave on his feet." A couple of Stephen's colleagues shuffled forward, helping him toward the front gate. He shot Vera a lingering look as he stumbled away. "Call me," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Luther to hear. Once Stephen was gone, Luther turned his attention to Vera. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but she didn't speak. She clutched the hem of her dress as if holding herself together, her eyes darting nervously between Luther and Connie. "Inside." "Now," Luther said, his voice low but commanding. Vera nodded mutely, trailing behind him as he led her into the house. Connie moved to follow, but Luther stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Stay out here for now, sweetheart," he said softly. Connie opened her mouth to protest, but stopped when she saw the look in his eyes, a mix of heartbreak and unwavering resolve. Inside, the house felt eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Luther closed the door to the kitchen and turned to face Vera. "Start talking," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Vera flinched but didn't speak immediately. She looked everywhere except at Luther, her hands twisting together in a nervous knot. "I didn't want it to come out like this," she finally said. "Not in front of everyone." Luther slammed his palm onto the counter, making Vera jump. "And yet it did. So tell me, how long? How long have you been lying to me?" Tears streamed down her face, and her voice cracked as she replied. "It was just one mistake, Luther. One night, years ago. I never thought. I didn't know Connie wasn't yours until recently." "Recently?" Luther's voice rose, his disbelief palpable. "You've been sitting on this for how long?" 6 months, Vera admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stephen, he pressured me. He said he'd tell you if I didn't leave with him. I didn't know what to do. So you let him come here, to our anniversary party, and blow up our family?" Luther said, his voice breaking for the first time. "I thought I could keep him quiet." Vera sobbed. "I thought if I didn't rock the boat, we could move past this. I didn't want to lose you or Connie." Luther stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he shook his head. You already lost me, Vera. The second you chose to protect yourself instead of your family, you lost me. Back in the yard, Connie stood frozen by the cake, unable to process what she had just witnessed. Guests whispered as they slowly began to leave, their glances filled with pity or judgment. Her best friend, Alina, approached hesitantly. Connie, are you okay? Alina asked. Connie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know what's happening. My dad, he's my dad. He has to be. He is, Alina said firmly, wrapping an arm around Connie. No matter what anyone says. Inside the house, Luther's voice dropped to an almost unbearable calm. You need to leave. Vera blinked, stunned. Luther, please. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Now, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Pack a bag and go. We'll talk about the rest later. Right now, Connie needs me, and I need you gone. Defeated, Vera nodded. She disappeared into the bedroom, emerging minutes later with a small suitcase. She paused by the door, her voice trembling. I never stopped loving you, Luther. I hope you believe that. Luther didn't respond. He opened the door, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. As Vera walked out into the night, Luther turned his focus to the only thing that mattered now, Connie. After the door closed behind Vera, Luther leaned against the wall, his body heavy with exhaustion. His world had shattered in a single evening, but he didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Connie needed him now more than ever. In the backyard, Connie was still standing near the cake, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her fragile composure together. The remaining guests murmured among themselves, awkwardly trickling toward the gate. Luther stepped outside, his gaze finding Connie instantly. Sweetheart, he said gently as he approached her. She turned to him, her tear-streaked face breaking his heart. Is it true? She asked, her voice trembling. Am I not your daughter? Luther crouched in front of her, meeting her at eye level. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm but reassuring. Connie, listen to me. Biology doesn't change a damn thing. I've been your dad since the day you were born. Nothing will ever change that. Her lip quivered as fresh tears welled up. But Stephen said. Stephen doesn't know you, Luther interrupted, his voice filled with conviction. He hasn't been there for you. He didn't teach you how to ride a bike, help you with your homework, or cheer you on at every soccer game. I did. And I always will. Connie let out a small, broken sob and threw her arms around him. Luther held her tightly, his own tears finally escaping. He had faced down enemies in war zones, but this moment, holding his daughter while her world crumbled, was the hardest fight of his life. That night, Luther sat on the edge of Connie's bed as she drifted off to sleep. He'd read her favorite book aloud, just like he had when she was little, and promised her they would face everything together. As she finally fell into an uneasy slumber, he gently tucked the blankets around her and kissed her forehead. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window into the dark yard. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, sorrow, but above all, determination. He thought about Vera and the choices she had made. How could she lie to him for so many years? How could she stand by and let Stephen upend their lives? The trust they had built over 25 years was gone, and Luther wasn't sure it could ever be rebuilt. The doorbell rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He opened it to find his best friend, Nate, standing there, his face lined with concern. Word travels fast, Nate said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I heard what happened. How are you holding up? Luther gestured to the whiskey bottle on the counter. What do you think? Nate nodded grimly, pouring himself a glass. And Connie? She's hurting, Luther admitted, his voice heavy. But I'm not letting her go through this alone. She needs to know that I'm her dad, no matter what that piece of paper says. You're doing the right thing, Nate said. But what about Vera? Luther's jaw tightened. She's gone. I told her to leave, and she did. Nate raised an eyebrow. You think she's coming back? I don't care if she does, Luther replied flatly. She made her choice, and I'm making mine. My priority is Connie. Over the next few days, Luther focused on restoring a sense of normalcy for Connie. He drove her to school, helped her with her homework, and reminded her every chance he got that he was her father in every way that mattered. Slowly, her smiles began to return, though they didn't quite reach her eyes. At the same time, Luther began taking steps to protect himself and his daughter. He contacted an attorney to discuss his options, both for the divorce and for ensuring that Stephen had no legal claim to Connie. The mere thought of Stephen trying to insert himself into her life made Luther's blood boil. As the days passed, Connie began asking more questions. What happens now, Dad? Is Mom ever coming back? Luther knelt in front of her, his expression serious but kind. I don't know what's going to happen with your mom, he admitted. But what I do know is that I'll always be here for you. You're my daughter, Connie. No one can ever take that away from us. Connie nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and hope. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart, Luther said, pulling her into a hug. Vera sat in a small motel room on the edge of town, the peeling wallpaper and dim lighting reflecting the state of her own life. Her suitcase lay half unpacked on the bed, but she barely noticed it as she stared blankly at her phone. Messages from friends and colleagues piled up, a mix of concern and judgment. She hadn't dared to call Luther. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the party. Stephen's dramatic revelation, Luther's fury, Connie's devastated expression, each memory felt like a dagger. She had been foolish to think she could control Stephen or keep her secret forever. Now, the life she had built for 25 years was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. When she finally worked up the courage, she dialed Luther's number. The phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling. Luther, it's me. I don't know where to start. I'm so sorry for everything, for the lies, for letting it get this far. I made terrible choices, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, please don't shut me out completely. I still love you. And Connie, her voice broke. She's my daughter too. Tell her I love her. I'll be here if you ever want to talk. She ended the call and set the phone down, her hands shaking. The weight of her guilt was suffocating. Vera had always believed she was in control of her marriage, her job, her life. But Stephen had been a mistake, one she had buried so deeply that she had almost convinced herself it didn't matter. Until it did. The next morning, Vera tried to distract herself with errands. She stopped by the school to meet with the principal, hoping to salvage her job. The scandal had spread quickly, whispers about her affair reaching every corner of the small town. Vera, the principal said, his tone heavy with disappointment, I don't think it's appropriate for you to continue here, given the circumstances. We're going to have to ask for your resignation. Vera nodded, her throat tight. I understand. She signed the paperwork and left the school for the last time, her reputation in shambles. She sat in her car, staring at the empty parking lot, wondering where to go next. Meanwhile, back at home, Luther listened to Vera's voicemail in silence. Her words stirred a mix of anger and sadness in him. Part of him wanted to erase the message and move on, but another part, the one that remembered their happy years together, hesitated. He replayed the message once, then set the phone down. Connie walked into the kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Dad, who was that? No one important, Luther said, forcing a smile. Let's get you to school. Connie steadied his face for a moment but didn't press further. She trusted him to protect her, even if he wasn't ready to share everything yet. That evening, Vera sat alone in her motel room, staring at a framed photo of Connie as a toddler. Tears blurred her vision as she traced her daughter's smile with her finger. I'll fix this, she whispered to herself. Somehow, I'll fix this. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about fixing her relationship with Connie or Luther. She needed to confront the choices that had led her here and decide whether she had the strength to rebuild her life. Stephen Herring wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. Nursing his dislocated shoulder in a makeshift sling, he seethed over his humiliation at the Swanson anniversary party. His plan to expose the truth and win Vera over had backfired spectacularly. But he wasn't finished yet. He sat in his car outside the local coffee shop, scrolling through social media posts from the party. Pictures of the happy family before his arrival mocked him. Stephen's jaw tightened as he considered his next move. If Vera was too scared to leave Luther outright, maybe it was time to force her hand another way. Stephen pulled out his phone and called a lawyer. "I need to discuss parental rights," he said, his tone smug. "There's a girl, Connie Swanson. She's my daughter, and I want to be part of her life." At home, Luther was spending his Saturday morning helping Connie with her science project. They worked side by side at the kitchen table, carefully assembling a model of the solar system. "Dad, do you think Mom's okay?" Connie asked suddenly, her voice hesitant. Luther paused, his hand steadying a foam planet. "I think she's figuring things out," he said carefully. "But right now, what matters most is us. We're a team, and nothing's going to change that." Connie nodded, her expression a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I just don't want things to fall apart even more," she whispered. "They won't," Luther promised, his voice firm. But as he spoke, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, his stomach sinking when he saw an email from a law office. He opened it, reading the words that confirmed his worst fear. "Stephen Herring is petitioning for paternity testing and partial custody of Connie Swanson." Luther's hand clenched around the phone as anger surged through him. "Not a chance," he muttered under his breath. That afternoon, Luther met with his attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Meredith Kane. She reviewed the petition with a practiced eye, her expression unreadable. "Do you think he has a case?" Luther asked, his voice tight. Meredith looked up, her gaze steady. "Biologically, he might. Legally, it's complicated. You've raised Connie as your daughter her entire life, and that holds weight. But if he pushes for a paternity test, the court might consider his claim." "Over my dead body," Luther growled. Meredith raised an eyebrow. "Then we fight. But I need you to be prepared. This won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Are you ready for that?" Luther nodded without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my daughter." While Luther prepared for the legal battle ahead, Stephen wasted no time trying to insert himself into Connie's life. One afternoon, as Connie walked home from school, Stephen pulled up beside her in his car. "Hey there," he called out, lowering the window. "Connie, right? I'm Stephen. Your mom's friend." Connie hesitated, clutching her backpack strapped tightly. Hi," she said cautiously. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened at the party," Stephen continued, his tone smooth. "You didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of all that. But I want you to know, I'm here for you. If you ever have questions or just want to talk, here's my number." He handed her a card with his contact information. Connie stared at the card, her stomach churning. Something about Stephen felt off, and she didn't trust his overly friendly demeanor. "Thanks," she said quickly, stuffing the card into her pocket and walking away. When she got home, she handed the card to Luther. "Some guy gave this to me," she said. "He said he's Stephen." Luther's expression darkened as he took the card. "Did he say anything else?" "No, just that he's there if I need to talk," Connie replied. It was weird. Luther clenched his jaw, his anger barely contained. "You did the right thing telling me, Connie. I'll take care of this." Luther wasted no time responding to Stephen's unwanted interference. The next morning, he was on the phone with Meredith Kane, explaining the encounter. Her response was swift and unyielding. Stephen is walking a fine line between asserting his claim and harassment, Meredith said. I'll file a restraining order on Connie's behalf to protect her from direct contact. But I need you to keep detailed records of anything he says or does from now on. Luther agreed, his resolve hardening. He had spent years protecting his family from the shadows of his past as a soldier. Now, he would do the same in the courtroom. 2 weeks later, Luther sat in a packed family courtroom, the air heavy with tension. Stephen sat smugly at the opposing table, his arm still in a sling from the dislocated shoulder. Beside him was his attorney, a wiry man with a sharp tongue and a penchant for theatrics. Meredith leaned over and whispered to Luther, "Don't let his posturing get to you. The judge will focus on facts." The hearing began with Stephen's lawyer arguing that his client had the right to a paternity test and partial custody of Connie. "My client has been unfairly denied the chance to be a part of his biological daughter's life," the lawyer said dramatically. "He merely wants the opportunity to establish a relationship with her." Meredith countered with calm precision. "Your Honor, while Mr. Herring may be Connie's biological father, he has played no role in her upbringing. My client, Mr. Swanson, has been Connie's sole father figure since birth. Granting Mr. Herring any form of custody would disrupt the stability and well-being of a child who has already endured significant upheaval." Luther watched as the judge, a no-nonsense woman with steely eyes, reviewed the evidence. His military training had taught him patience, but every fiber of his being wanted to stand up and tell Stephen exactly what he thought of him. The judge turned to Stephen. "Mr. Herring, why have you chosen to come forward now, after 16 years? Why didn't you assert your paternity sooner?" Stephen faltered, clearly unprepared for the question. "I didn't know the truth until recently," he stammered. "When I found out, I felt it was my responsibility to step up." Meredith didn't let the moment slip by. "Your Honor, the timing is suspicious at best. Mr. Herring only became interested in asserting his so-called responsibility after my client's wife rejected him." Stephen's face reddened, but he said nothing. At home that evening, Luther and Connie sat at the kitchen table, sharing a quiet dinner. Connie picked at her food, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Luther asked gently. Connie hesitated before replying. "Dad, what happens if the judge says Stephen is my dad?" Luther reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "No matter what anyone says, I'm your dad, Connie. I always have been, and I always will be. A court decision can't change that." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, squeezing his hand. "I don't want him in my life," she whispered. "You won't have to worry about that," Luther promised. "I'll make sure of it." The following week, the judge delivered her decision. While Stephen was granted the right to request a paternity test, the court emphasized that any further custody claims would depend on proving his involvement was in Connie's best interest. The restraining order, however, was approved, barring Stephen from contacting Connie directly. Luther felt a surge of relief, though he knew the battle wasn't over. Stephen wasn't the type to give up easily, and Luther would need to stay vigilant. Meanwhile, Vera had been watching the court proceedings from afar, unsure of her place in the unfolding drama. She had tried reaching out to Connie several times, but her daughter's responses were polite and distant. Each unanswered call or curt text was another reminder of what Vera had lost. One evening, Vera decided to write Connie a letter. She poured her heart onto the page, admitting her mistakes and expressing her love for her daughter. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she wrote, "but I hope one day we can find a way back to each other." Luther worked tirelessly to restore stability for Connie. The court's decision to grant Stephen a paternity test weighed heavily on him, but the restraining order provided a crucial buffer. Connie began returning to a sense of normalcy, though the scars of the ordeal lingered. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Connie spoke up. "Dad, do you think this is over? Or is he going to keep trying?" Luther looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. "Stephen might try, but he doesn't have what it takes to be your father. He can demand tests and file claims, but the bond we have isn't something the law can measure." That's something he'll never understand. Connie nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. I don't care about biology. You're my dad. In her small apartment across town, Vera stared at the letter she'd written to Connie. She had rewritten it 3 times, agonizing over every word. Finally, she folded it into an envelope and placed it in the mailbox, hoping against hope that her daughter would read it. Days passed without a response. Then, one Saturday afternoon, as Vera returned home from the grocery store, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Connie. I got your letter. I'm not ready to talk yet, but I appreciate that you reached out. Maybe someday. Vera clutched the phone to her chest, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Stephen's attempts to force his way into Connie's life met one obstacle after another. The paternity test confirmed what everyone already knew. He was Connie's biological father, but his lack of involvement over the years weighed heavily against him. The judge denied his petition for custody, citing Luther's consistent presence and the restraining order as evidence of Stephen's unsuitability. Humiliated, Stephen confronted Vera in the parking lot of her apartment complex one evening. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You promised me everything, and now I have nothing." Vera stared at him, her fear replaced by anger. "You destroyed my family, Stephen. You turned my daughter against me. Don't you dare blame me for your failures." Stephen stepped closer, but Vera held her ground. "Stay away from me. Stay away from my daughter. You've done enough damage." Something in her voice made Stephen falter. He muttered a curse under his breath and stormed off, leaving Vera to stand alone but strangely empowered. Months later, Luther and Connie found themselves rebuilding their lives with a new sense of clarity and purpose. Connie threw herself into her studies, excelling in school and earning a spot on the varsity soccer team. Luther, inspired by her resilience, began coaching youth sports in the community, finding fulfillment in helping other kids reach their potential. One afternoon, Connie surprised him with a framed picture for his office. It was an old photo of the two of them, taken when she was 5. In her small, careful handwriting, she had written across the bottom, "The best dad in the world, always." Luther's throat tightened as he hugged her. "Thank you, sweetheart. This means more to me than you'll ever know." As they sat together in their quiet home, Connie glanced at the mail on the counter. Among the usual bills and flyers was another letter from Vera. "Do you think I should read it?" she asked softly. Luther nodded. "Only if you're ready. Take it at your own pace, Connie. This is your choice." Connie picked up the envelope and studied it for a moment before tucking it into her backpack. "Maybe later," she said with a small smile. For the first time in months, Luther felt a deep sense of peace. They still had battles to fight, but they were facing them together, and that made all the difference. 6 months had passed since the court denied Stephen's custody petition. Life had slowly settled into a new normal for Luther and Connie. The house, once filled with tension, now echoed with laughter and the scent of Connie's experiments in baking. On weekends, the two continued the tradition of working on projects together, their bond stronger than ever. One crisp autumn afternoon, Luther received a letter in the mail. The return address caught his attention. It was from Stephen's attorney. With a deep breath, he opened it and scanned the contents. To his surprise, it wasn't another legal threat. It was an agreement to withdraw all claims of custody and paternity rights. Stephen, it seemed, had finally conceded defeat. Luther handed the letter to Meredith, who reviewed it carefully. "It's legitimate," she confirmed. "This is the end of his attempts. He's out of your life." For the first time in over a year, Luther allowed himself a moment to exhale deeply. "Good riddance," he muttered. Meanwhile, Vera continued her journey of self-reflection and repair. She had moved to a nearby town and started a new job managing a small bookstore. The quiet life suited her, giving her time to focus on herself and come to terms with the choices that had brought her here. One Saturday morning, Vera sat down to write another letter to Connie. Unlike her previous attempts, this one wasn't about asking for forgiveness, it was about expressing gratitude. "Connie," she wrote, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. I know I haven't been the mother you deserved, but you've grown into someone so strong and resilient, and that's a testament to you and your father. Whether or not you ever decide to let me back into your life, I'll always be cheering for you from afar." She mailed the letter without expecting a reply, feeling lighter for having written it. That evening, as Connie sat at her desk finishing homework, she noticed the envelope from her mother tucked into her drawer. She had avoided reading it, unsure if she was ready to face the emotions it might bring. But tonight felt different. She opened the letter and read it slowly, her eyes misting over as she absorbed Vera's words. For the first time, she felt a small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. "Dad," she called out, walking into the living room where Luther was watching a baseball game. He muted the TV and looked up. "What's up?" Connie held out the letter. I think I might want to talk to her." Luther studied her expression carefully before nodding. "If that's what you want, sweetheart, I'll support you. But only if you feel ready." Connie smiled. "I think I am." A few weeks later, Connie met Vera for coffee in a small cafe in Vera's new town. The meeting was tentative but civil. They spoke about school, Connie's soccer games, and the bakery items on display. Vera didn't push for forgiveness, and Connie appreciated that. When the meeting ended, Connie gave her mother a small hug. "Maybe we can do this again sometime," Connie said softly. Vera blinked back tears and nodded. "I'd like that." As the seasons changed, so did the lives of the Swanson family. Connie thrived in her senior year, earning a scholarship to a nearby college. Luther continued coaching youth sports and found joy in mentoring kids in the community. On the night of Connie's graduation, Luther sat in the audience, his chest swelling with pride as she walked across the stage. When she found him afterward, diploma in hand, she threw her arms around him. "We did it, Dad," she said with a grin. "No," Luther replied, his voice full of emotion. "You did it. And I couldn't be prouder." As they walked toward the car, Connie glanced at the setting sun and smiled. The shadows of the past had finally lifted, replaced by the bright promise of a new future.